Jenny Datu, and I will be moderating today's Fields of the Future speaker series, exploring carbon capture, utilization, and storage. To share a little bit about me, I'm working in the climate change group at the World Bank in Washington, D.C. My role is currently focused on implementing an organization-wide rollout of Paris alignment across all World Bank projects. Prior to joining the international development space, I worked in the banking sector, focusing on treasury management solutions for corporate 100 companies. The Fields of the Future speaker series is a collaboration between many Jamaati institutions in the United States and Canada, including the Aga Khan Education Board, the Climate Change Portfolio, and Ismaili Professionals Network. We hope that the series provides insights as you explore career paths, innovation, and opportunities in selected fields of the future. I am very pleased and excited to introduce you to our speaker for today, Al-Karim Govindji. Al-Karim is the Global Head of Public Affairs for DNV Energy, an energy and risk advisory firm. He develops DNV's policy-related relationships with national and regional governments, with government sector associations, as well as with customers in the energy value chain. He supports policymakers on identifying how to best limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius through the most effective adoption of technologies such as wind, solar, hydrogen, CCUS, energy efficiency, and energy storage. Prior to taking up this role, Al-Karim led DNV's energy efficiency business across Northern Europe, Middle East, and Africa, supporting industrial, commercial, and utility customers. Previously, Al-Karim worked at the Carbon Trust on innovation policy in areas such as offshore wind and sustainable aviation biofuels. His early career was in strategy consulting for Carney in banking with Bank of America. Al-Karim has a degree in chemical engineering from the University of Birmingham and an MBA from Oxford University. And now, without further ado, Al-Karim will speak to us about the career, his career path, and how this field will evolve in the future. Al-Karim, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jenny. And firstly, thank you very much for inviting me to have this discussion today. It's a very exciting time for the energy transition. And I think there are many opportunities for our Jamaat to engage in that. So looking forward to the discussions today. So I'm going to talk about carbon capture utilization storage, which in shorthand is called CCUS. And whilst I talk about CCUS, the general pattern of discussion potentially relates also to other clean technologies such as wind and solar storage that you may well have come across. But hopefully you'll get a bit of a feel for CCUS in particular as well. So I will just talk us through a little bit about CCUS and its technology importance, a little bit about career paths for myself as well as for how others can engage in this industry and related industries, and then what's the future opportunities for CCUS and the energy transition. So just want to start a little bit before we discuss CCUS, just looking at where emissions happen globally today. So we have around 59 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent that's emitted every single year around the world. And that happens in various different forms, in power generation. It happens in the oil and gas industry from methane emissions. It happens in land use. It happens from methane from our animals, from agriculture, from industry, and then obviously from buildings that are being powered and heated, and transport, largely from diesel and petrol for our cars, ships, planes, etc., and trucks. So that's where the emissions happen globally. How do those emissions break down in terms of the type of gas that's emitted? Carbon dioxide, as you can see, is the predominant emitting gas, around 75%. But methane is also there. And one thing to bear in mind, methane has a very high potency in terms of its impact on global warming. It's something like 100 times more potent than CO2. So even low levels of methane relative to carbon dioxide can have a huge impact on our climate. As I go through this presentation, you may see some other numbers, particularly that 59 gigatons in total. You'll see a slightly different number of around 33, 34 gigatons. That's because that's focused much more around CO2 only and very much around energy-related emissions. So it won't include things like emissions from methane and from such things like oil and gas emissions around methane from those facilities. So there'll be some exclusions in that 34. But I think in essence, I wouldn't worry too much about that difference in number. It's just a different way of looking at those. So here is really where we're heading. And I think it's worth seeing what the expected future is likely to be. And this is taken from DNV's own annual energy transitions outlook, but you'll see very similar forecasts from other organizations like the International Energy Agency, as well as some company forecasts like from BP and others. So this is where we are today. We're around 33 gigatons. That's, as I say, CO2 specific emissions. It doesn't include methane and the other gases. And where are we expecting to be? Well, by 2050, that 34 gigatons, beg your pardon, should be around 18 gigatons by 2050. Now, in order for us to be able to achieve this, what we call this 1.5 degree world, what was agreed at the Paris Agreement to limit global warming to within 1.5 degrees higher than pre-industrial levels, then that emissions needs to come down to zero, of course, by 2050. We're saying it's only going to come down to about half. And in fact, to be on this pathway, we needed to be much, much faster in terms of our emissions reductions than we're likely to be here, showing only 44% reduction by 2030, which needs to be close to 43%. So we're a long, long way away from where we need to be. And with emissions peaking in 2024, doesn't look like we're actually going to make the 1.5 degrees. So it's not a very positive story, but the chance of us achieving that 1.5 is getting harder and harder for us. So what is CCUS? Carbon capture and storage. Well, as the name kind of indicates, there's carbon is being emitted from power plants, etc., from industries, and that carbon, of course, usually just goes straight to the air and has an impact on our climate. So the idea is to capture that carbon using various scrubbers and membranes and processes and to separate it from some of the other gases and then either use it in some of the processes that need it. Things like refining often use carbon, oil and gas recovery often uses carbon dioxide as well. So there are a host of other uses for carbon. So that can be used for various purposes. But it needs to be transported, of course. And so it's typically transported by pipeline or by ships to wherever it needs to be, either to the source of demand in terms of the use, or it's stored in underground caves, salt caverns, and such, where it permanently stays there. So it's a little bit like oil and gas has been in the ground for many millions of years. That's effectively what you would do with CO2, is to penetrate it down into those caverns and keep it there and store it there for as long as we would want it to be there, which is pretty much permanently, unless it happens to be extracted for any future purpose. So that's in a simple form what CCUS is. It's the emissions being captured, either being used or transported and then stored in various facilities. So we often hear the term direct air capture. Direct air capture is a way of capturing carbon, not from the carbon that's coming out from power plants and from industrial processes, but directly from the air. So essentially fans and such capture the air from the atmosphere, and inside their various chemical processes occur, heat happens, and the CO2 essentially is separated again from other gases, and then again in the normal way can be transported and stored, as you saw in the previous diagram. The problem with direct air capture is there's far less CO2 in the air than what comes from industrial process. Industrial processes is much more concentrated in terms of CO2. So you get a lot more CO2 by capturing that carbon from industrial processes, or that coming out from power plants that are being burned for electricity, than you do from direct air capture. So something to think about in terms of the impact direct air capture can have in the future. So how much are we actually capturing today? You can see from this chart that it's been growing in the last 20 or 30 years, but the actual volume of carbon that's captured through these carbon capture facilities and methodologies is around 42, 43 million tons per year, which is only about 0.1% of global emissions. So we're not capturing actually very much today. So how much potentially could we capture in the future if we continue to deploy this technology? So this is where we are today, that 40 or so million tons that I showed here. This is a gigaton scale here. So it's a much smaller value, or much smaller number you see here in gigatons. And you see there is an increase over time expected where CCUS becomes much more cost effective. And the reason why it's not being deployed today is like any other technology. You saw that things like wind and solar had to go through a cost reduction exercise before it was deployed in large volumes. And so CCUS similarly has to go through the same trajectory to reduce the cost of that technology and to have it deployed. And you see that it is not likely to actually get deployed in significant volumes for quite some time. So what the expectation, certainly from DNV's expectation, is we'll capture about 1.2 gigatons of that carbon dioxide, which out of that 33, 34 gigatons I showed you today, or out of the 18 gigatons that we expect to be there in 2050, is around 6%. So it's a number, it's not insignificant, but of course it's not the panacea. And we will need all of the technologies essentially in order for us to eliminate carbon, including all of those renewables, including energy efficiency to reduce overall demand of energy, etc. So some things to really think about in the CCUS journey over time. The uptake is likely to be only significant in the 2040s, again, largely because it's still so expensive today to deploy. It requires huge investment, so lots of money has to be put into it to help it work and to continue to reduce the costs in terms of technology improvements. There are financial incentives that are now being offered by various governments. One in particular in the US is the Inflation Reduction Act. And even before the Inflation Reduction Act, there was something called 45Q, which was an incentive for deployers of CCUS, people who would capture that carbon, to get a benefit for every ton of carbon that they saved, which now can be up to $180 depending on the type and way in which you capture that carbon. It can be between $60 and $180. And other countries are deploying investments and providing incentives in different ways. In the UK, for example, where I'm based, those incentives come in the form of grants for projects to start up CCUS projects. So there's different mechanisms in which governments can try and facilitate and encourage the deployment of this technology. One thing also to remember, whilst it's not necessarily an unmanageable risk, CO2 does have its dangers. And when you pressurize it, which is what you have to do, and push it down pipelines, there are risks, and it's not very pretty when something like that breaks down. But again, there are many gases that are dangerous, and so we just have to manage those risks through the way you design and build those pipelines. Interestingly, Elon Musk has got into the game a little bit, and he's introduced these huge prize, 100 million prize for people to capture carbon. And so the recipients of this money have to demonstrate that they are able to scale up what they're doing today, and they could capture megatons of carbon, not just small volumes. So there is a criteria, of course, for people to receive prizes from this particular competition. But it's nice to see that there are others outside of the traditional energy transition space that are also looking at CCUS. Okay, let's talk a little bit about career paths. And my trajectory, I must say, is not necessarily particularly orthodox by any stretch of the imagination. But it may give you a sense of the types of ways that I got into this industry. And I got into this industry fairly late in 2008, and I started my career much earlier. So there have been many transitions in my career to enable me to get here. But also bear in mind that I started my career earlier than many of our listeners will have started their careers, or be not even in a career. You might still be at high school, for example. And so the dynamics of the energy business and the energy industry, and particularly around clean technologies like CCUS, has changed and has become very competitive, certainly in the last 5 years or so. So I started off as we heard earlier from the University of Birmingham in the UK, doing chemical engineering. It's not a career that I followed. I went immediately into banking, working for a number of banks in the UK and in the US. And after I did that for about 8 years, I actually went and took a year off and worked at the AKDN in Tajikistan and did a little bit of microfinance work there in Korog, looking at really supporting and providing loan funding to small businesses to try and set up activities for them, whether it was around rural stuff, around buildings, whatever they could do and whatever that we could finance as an organization. Subsequently, then on my return, I joined an online financial services consultancy called Gomez at the time, now called Dynatrace, which supported, particularly in the early days of the internet, around the development of online financial services like online trading, online banking, online credit cards and such. I then went to business school, joined Oxford and did a full-time MBA, a single-year program. And then after that joined Carney as part of their strategy consultancy business. And that was very much around operational consulting, strategy consulting, very classic consulting that you see in some of the big firms. And after that, then I went into energy consulting. So it wasn't, as I said, until 2008 or so, I joined Carbon Trust, where I looked very much around policies and what sort of policies can drive the adoption of technologies, what is needed around the world to drive encouraging deployment of clean technologies, but also running accelerator programs. So these are large-scale programs that bring public money as well as private money together with a view to try and deploy R&D projects and come to a common understanding of how you can reduce the cost, for example, of offshore wind. So in those days, if you think about an offshore wind farm, you have many cables that run underground, you have the actual structure, the tower, you have the blades, etc. So the project and the accelerator looked at how you reduce the cost of those technologies by sharing R&D across a number of companies that are deploying offshore wind. And that sharing of R&D is an important way to reduce costs. I then left and joined DNV about 5.5 years ago. And so that's where I've been. And this is where I'm now today, looking at particularly around policies and how policies are impacting the customers that we work with along the energy value chain, from oil and gas companies to decarbonize, to grid companies to deploy more grids, from CCUS companies to try and encourage them and understand how they could deploy CCUS or develop the technology, to wind farms and wind developers, etc., and to end users like industrials to see how they can reduce their emissions. So that was my kind of career path. And so I guess when you look at what each of these things gave me, each of those kinds of areas of work gave me different things. Banking certainly gave me numeracy and looking at returns on investments and how you look at assets and investing in assets. The work at the AKDN helped me think about the North-South challenge. So if you think about climate change today, part of the challenge is that the developed world has the resources, has had the benefit of economic development from using fossil fuels, and has caused much of the emissions in the global south. the Global South, A, doesn't have the money to deploy a lot of these renewables, and also wasn't responsible for what we see in terms of the impacts of climate change in those regions, in places like Africa, Latin America, Southern Asia, etc. So that helped me think about that North-South divide in particular and the needs of developing countries. The consulting experience helped me think strategically or structurally and really analytical thinking. And finally, I've got technical insights from the work I've done in energy consulting. So as a package, all of those things are needed and important in any career, whether it's in CCUS, whether it's in related technologies, or more generally in the energy transition. So what are some of the things that you might want to think about, depending on where you are? You might be at high school thinking about a future career in CCUS or other technologies. You might be at university doing a degree in history or maths or classics, or you may even be doing a degree in sustainability. You might be in your career already working in finance or marketing or other area. So I think there are many opportunities at all of these levels to try and at least start the process of thinking about entering this field. I think at the high school level, certainly there will be lots of career seminars. There'll be the potential at the ages of perhaps 16 and 17, certainly in the UK, and maybe the case in other countries around the world, to do company internships, and I highly encourage those. They could be a few days shadowing someone. It could be a week or two working in a company to see how things work. They may even get you to do actual, meaningful work and looking at different technologies and understanding how they work and perhaps supporting some of the projects that they're working on. At universities, of course, there's always a question whether you look at the undergraduate level or the graduate level, and I think each country is a little bit different in terms of the degrees to do. But maybe one thing I can say, particularly as I'm recruiting people at the graduate level, let's say, I don't spend a lot of time on CVs, and I perhaps spend 30 seconds on a CV, because for a typical job at a graduate level we might have 100, 150 applicants. And so to enable myself to be able to sift through those in any meaningful way, I have to use certain criteria to actually break that list down into a 20 or 30 that I can actually spend a bit of time on. And so one way to do that is to look at people with a sustainability academic qualification and or some type of experience working in a company that does sustainability or technology development or policy work linked to energy. And so from that perspective, when I look at people, those things rise up to the top. And so I guess what I'm saying is that having some of that relevant experience as early as possible and building that and getting more and more sophisticated in the type of that experience as you get from high school through to university and into your early career would really help you stand out from the many, many, many other qualified people. And trust me, we get CVs from all the top universities, and they're not the ones necessarily that get picked. But I would say the brand of the university is very, very, very important. And so that's, again, a criteria. And in some ways, I would rather see someone from doing what might be regarded as not the best course at a top university than doing what might be considered the fantastic course, but not from a well-known university. So I think the worst course at Harvard or Stanford or Cambridge is probably better than the worst course at another university that isn't as highly regarded. So some things actually to think about in terms of branding and what employers look for as you choose your degrees. But other lots of opportunities at the university level in campus green clubs. So there'll be clubs looking at technologies, and I would highly recommend you join those. Again, look at company internships. Those will be available to you from the age of 17, 18, 19. So every year, every summer, you should be getting an internship. And if this is a career that's important to you, then look for companies that work in this space. And once you're in a career, of course, and you've worked, maybe you've taken a slightly different path, there are still opportunities to attend conferences, to do constant learning through MOOCs and other vehicles. But I would also say if you want to make a switch, then make a switch in one degree. So you can't change your sector and your function at the same time. Switch one or the other, because that's the easiest way to do it. So if you're working in a chemicals industry in marketing, then look to work for the same company in a function that is more related to sustainability, join the sustainability group. If you're working in finance, okay, then the way you might make the transition is to look and work for a VC that is investing in clean technologies, and what you bring is your financial analytical skills and investment skills to their business. So I think those ways of making that one step towards your ideal job is the way to do it. I've put here a number of resources. Some of those are CCUS specific, some are more general, and these hopefully slides can be shared with the links to each of these. The Global CCUS Institute, looking at, it's a member organization that's global. The CCSA is a European organization that has various companies that work in the CCS space. So I encourage you to look at those resources. They'll also have reports and materials that'll be useful for you to get to learn and talk about. And again, this will give you fodder to then, when you're going to interviews or having conversations with people, these backgrounds in understanding the industry, which will really help you. And one thing I found very useful in my career was just reaching out to people, particularly your alumni network at your university. Reach out to people who are in the space that you're in and ask them for a coffee. And ideally, send them one page of your thoughts on the industry you're trying to get into. Take some of the information you see here, because that demonstrates something more than I just want to have a coffee with you and understand what you do in your career path. I want to actually show you some of the things that I've been thinking about. And I think that's a really powerful way to actually increase the chance that they will have a coffee with you. And you'll be surprised how many people will say yes. I get so many hits on LinkedIn and others for people who just want to have a chat. And if there's a link in particular because they went to the same university or interested in the same career, then more often than not, I'm willing to have that conversation with them. So be brave and take the chance to speak to the people that they need to. And there's various other resources here that you can reach to. So then finally, around CCUS and its importance going forward, oil and gas industry from our view is going to be around the mix, just so you know, in terms of the mix between fossil use and non-fossil use, in terms of our expectation of where we'll be to 2050 is around 50-50. So oil and gas is going to be around for many, many years to come. And oil and gas needs to be decarbonized. So the carbon needs to be taken out of it. And CCUS, of course, is a way to do it. We're going to have power, and much of the power will come from gas for many years as well. Industries will struggle to use other forms to heat up, particularly industries like steel, which use very high temperatures. Glass and ceramics use very high temperatures, and it's hard to use electricity or green electricity to get to those temperatures. So industry will use other gases, perhaps hydrogen, but some forms of hydrogen also need carbon capture and storage. So there's plenty of opportunity there. There is a constant need to innovate and to reduce the cost of CCUS. So it's really important we continue to make those investments. So I can see governments continuing to focus and supporting CCUS on the long term to drive those incentives for industry to deploy. And maybe finally, just to look at a way of looking about technology development. And remember, most technologies today still have incentives, right? Things are kind of coming off incentives. Solar is now starting to be incentive free. Wind does not seem to need any incentives today from government to deploy. CCUS still does. It's still very, very expensive. But all of these technologies have gone through a cycle, and technology readiness levels is something that looks at the way technology from a very early stage at 1 and 2 to a later stage at 8 and 9 before it becomes then commercial. So there are various different entry points when you think about a technology. And if you take CCUS as an example, but this applies, as I say, to any emerging technology, at the early stage, much of that work is done in academia and through research. So those universities and research institutes do a lot of that work. So there are opportunities to get involved from an R&D perspective in that early stage. Technology acceleration, I talked about a little bit earlier, which is really this 4 to 7 space to really move it from a kind of concept phase into a first of pilot or first demonstration case before you start to see a much more concrete design and methodology around that technology. That's technology acceleration. And then you see VCs coming in a bit later on, pre-commercial, because they still want to invest in things that are a little bit earlier stage, but which have the potential to grow. So you see VCs coming in, so there's potential to access this space through the VC angle. Policy would really go through the whole place. And as I say, policy will fund academic research, it'll fund acceleration, technology acceleration, it'll fund pre-revenue technologies. Policy, particularly with governments and others, and working in policy related to CCUS and related technologies, is another space that you can access. Technology road mapping. So this is something that a lot of the larger consultancies, the Big Four, the McKinseys, the Bains and BCGs get involved with. DNV is much more an implementation consultancy, much more engineering-based consultancy. We're really helping to deploy some of these projects. People like McKinsey and others work at a kind of slightly higher level, looking at much more high level about how an organization changes. And so if you're working in consulting, then there is a way, again, to switch across from an area you might be working in financial services or in FMCG or in other industries on the strategy side, but you can actually then think to pivot into some clean technologies, because all of these big firms have fairly large now and sizable and growing sustainability teams. And implementation, which is where I say is much more on the engineering side, is coming in much later. And actually, from the work you're doing today, as I say, there are ways to transition. If you're doing a PhD, you can then think about getting into academic research to support this early phase. If you're working in product development for an FMCG, for Unilever, or for Procter & Gamble, or for Apple, or for Siemens, or for Samsung, that kind of ability to think about how you develop a product can be applied to think about how you can develop a technology, right, in the clean technology space. Banking, finance, etc., and VCs, I mentioned, is very relevant. Policy, I talked about. Strategy, I've talked about. And engineering, particularly for an engineer. There are lots of mechanical engineers, civil engineers, etc., working in my organization, looking at anything from wind farms to solar, to CCUS, to other technologies, because that engineering capability is really very, very helpful and needed. So that's what I will leave it in terms of the presentation. But I'll hand it over back to Jenny.
Sounds good. Thank you so much, Al-Karim, for sharing your field of the future with us today. I'm sure I speak on behalf of everyone here today. We genuinely enjoyed hearing about how widespread this field is and with so many opportunities. With that, I will open the floor to questions. So I'll start with some technical questions that have rolled in, Al-Karim, and then we'll pivot a little bit to some career-related questions that have come in. So the first is, earlier in your presentation, you talked about how this is picking up slowly and captures about 6% of emissions, all the way through 2050. Why do you feel like it is taking so long for CCUS to be cost effective? Furthermore, what would you say are some of the challenges associated with the evolution of CCUS? One specific question that somebody asked, and I think I'll combine the two, is there a lot of companies, a lot of organizations have aspired and really clenched on the 2030 to be, a year of transfer by 2030, being a space of transformational change. How far along are we in meeting, any targets for 2030, but also beyond?
Okay, let me take those in order, I guess. I mean, the first one is, why is it taking so long? What are the kind of things that are preventing CCUS adoption? I think it's just cost is a key one, right? So if you think about that diagram I showed you about the different parts of the CCUS process, you need the capture technology, right, to be able to capture the carbon in the first place. So that has to be deployed on an industrial plant or a power plant. Then you need the actual transportation. So you have to build pipelines or have ships capable of transporting that CO2 in safely, right, as I mentioned. And then you have to find the technology to actually store this stuff under the ground. So that whole piece, and of course there are different parties that are engaged in different parts of that. Not one company will do necessarily all of that. So you might have a CCUS technology company that captures the carbon. You might have another company that deals with the pipelines. You might have another company or series of industries that deal with the storing of it. So connecting all of these things up is also a challenge in terms of aligning needs, aligning incentives, splitting the share of revenues and who pays for all of this. So all of that, the high cost in terms of the capital cost, but also the sharing of the costs across those different parts of the CCUS chain make it difficult. The other thing to remember is CCUS is not like, you do get paid for it from if you have incentives. If government pays for it, then you have incentives to capture it. But it's not like renewables, for example, with wind and solar and other forms of renewables where you create the energy and then you sell it in the market at the market prevailing rate, right? Here, you're capturing carbon, and yes, you can find people to buy some of that if another industry is buying that CO2 to use in other processes, but you have to find a ready market to sell this thing. And at the moment, the only way CCUS makes, and that's why I say it's 2040, because the way CCUS works is that the higher the carbon price, and I don't want to get too technical, but that we have a carbon price in the market. Different countries have different carbon schemes. The EU has the most, shall we say, mature carbon market, but California has one, China has one, and other countries have. Until that carbon price gets to really high, $200 per ton of carbon captured, then the emitters don't have a disincentive to emit it, right? And so they only feel the pain of carbon emissions when they are required to pay for it. So that's the other problem around carbon capture. I think around the 2030 goals, I think you saw from my slide that the emissions reduction is not going to happen very, very quickly. We're only going to see 4% reduction in emissions from the peak in 2024, where it needs to be actually 43% in order to be aligned with a 1.5 degree world. So, you know, overall, things are not looking very good. And just right now, just before COP28 in Dubai, which will be at the end of this month, we've got the global stocktake, which really starts to look at what countries have submitted as in terms of their ambitions, what we call nationally determined contributions, or NDCs. And the IEA said that these NDCs are not aggressive enough to be online with a 1.5 degree pathway. So we're far off from being where we need to be, not just in CCUS, but in all the other related technologies.
Thanks, Al-Karim, for that detailed response. Another question that has come in is, you know, and you talked about how it's expensive, and it's not something that you can just kind of do overnight. But why have governments not provided as much financial support to CCUS as they have for renewable technologies?
Yeah, I mean, I think it perhaps picks up on a little bit on my point that it is a bit more complicated, right? When you think about a wind farm. Let's say if you have an offshore wind farm outside of your coast of Maine or UK or Norway or India or wherever it might be. The government stipulates where those wind farms should be and issues licenses, and developers like BP, Ørsted, Equinor, Total Energies, all of these people bid for those licenses. And so they get the license and then they put a cost to that and say this is how much we'll pay for that license, and then they go down the path of constructing that wind farm. So there's kind of one party involved. When you think about CCUS, again, as I mentioned, there are so many different parties involved around this. Then the economics and the allocation of resources and the allocation of risks becomes much more complicated. So I think governments have found it much easier to deal with renewables, where they also get energy security, which of course a lot of them have been after lately, to make sure that they can have sufficient energy to power the people, the citizens, as well as the industries. CCUS doesn't generate the kind of value, shall we say, apparent value to society, right? Yes, it has a huge impact on the emissions, but you don't actually necessarily see that in dollars and in actual direct value. And that's why I think CCUS has taken a while and will continue to take a while to actually mature and be cost effective.
Great, thank you. Do you think that fusion is going to be a viable technology in the future? And if so, when?
I mean, I think it will be viable. And we're starting to see many more positive policies in Europe, in the USA, and in other markets around CCUS. So I think it will become viable. The question is, how long will it take? Do I expect it to be widely used in 2030? No. Bear in mind, some of these projects have started in the late, well, around 2008, 2009, 2010. Many projects have been demonstrated and started, and there's 40 or 50 CCUS projects around the world. So it's not as if there are not a shortage of projects that are trying to make it work. But that's not sufficient for us to see it capture sufficient volumes of CO2. We need a much more rapid cost reduction and then deployment to see it scale up. So I don't think we're going to see masses of it this decade.
Okay, thank you. All right, so I'll pivot a little bit and ask you a few questions around careers. Besides careers in carbon storage, sequestration, and policymaking, any thoughts on what other fields and professions will see an increase in demand in the years to come to mitigate climate change and adapt to climate change, both?
Yeah, so we need to see a tripling of renewables from now to 2030 globally. So, which is a huge ask. We need 11,000 gigawatts of renewables capacity by 2030, which is huge. We're around 3 or 4 today. And the scale of increase that's required on an annual basis from now to 2030, which is only 7 years, is quite immense. So lots of opportunities on the wind, on the solar, and such, those sides. And those two will be probably the predominant technologies from now to 2050 in terms of renewables, and will power most of the electricity that we have in 2050, which is clean. Hydrogen, there's been lots of discussion about hydrogen. Remember, hydrogen is used for things like, or could be used for things like powering ships. It could be used in industry as a source of heat instead of using natural gas, which of course emits carbon. It could be used for heavy trucks. So there's a number of uses for hydrogen. It is, again, costly. There are incentives in place to try and reduce the cost of hydrogen, but so that could be a play. Biofuels and bioenergy is going to be big, whether it's using woody mass or using other means of producing biomass, bioheat, or biofuels for aviation. So those are interesting technologies. You're actually seeing lots of countries go back to nuclear, in fact. So given the energy security concerns we've had, particularly in Europe, many countries, France has 3/4 of its energy or electricity comes from renewable, from nuclear, pardon me. So countries like Poland, like Czechoslovakia, UK are looking to get back into nuclear. And they're not doing it because it's cost effective, because it's very, 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 very expensive. They're doing it because they want to have sufficiency of supply and want to own the energy rather than having to import it. So those are some of the kind of clean technologies we see that are going to grow from now to 2050. And CCUS is a part of that story as well.
Super, thank you. When you were describing your trajectory in your career, you mentioned how you pivoted and you went to work for the AKDN in Tajikistan for a year. And you know, some of the questions and some of the comments that have been coming in are around if people want to work for the AKDN or potentially a development organization in general. Do you have any advice for them in that way? And then I think the second part of that is, how were you able to successfully pivot? You know, what was that what do you believe was that it factor for you to get into the AKDN and into that development space?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say it wasn't very intentional, my work with AKDN. It wasn't very well thought out. I had a year off, and so off I went. And to be honest, I found most of his roles while I was there. I had some discussions. I had a contact here in the UK who was working for AKDN in Tajikistan. And through that contact, I was able to secure some work. He knew I worked in banking previously, so microfinance made sense because microfinance is essentially a different type of loan, right? So again, this is around the one-step piece I mentioned. So if you have a capability in marketing, then go do marketing for the AKDN. If you have a capability in finance, go do finance at the AKDN. If you're an engineer, go do engineering work for something they're doing around road development or bridges or around clean technologies. So that's what I would say to people is take that one step and cut across, leverage your contacts, be available, be flexible, irrespective of where you're being sent, if you want to work for those organizations, particularly if it's abroad. And I think there are plenty of opportunities in these organizations to do so. One thing on the climate side, bear in mind the AKDN is also looking at this very, very seriously. And for people who don't know, all these climate task forces that have been set up around the world to try and help us to get our Jamaati institutions to net zero by 2030. I mean, all of that has stemmed on the back of AKDN's announcement back in March 2022 under the auspices of Prince Rahim to try and get the AKDN infrastructure to net zero by 2030. So AKDN is also doing a lot around habitats, of course, around technologies like this, around hydro facilities and clean technologies in various parts of the world, like East Africa. So there are opportunities also with AKDN in this space.
You know, there appears to be so much growth in the industry, right? You've talked about this over and over again, not only in CCUS, but beyond, I mean, in this whole space. But it still seems really tough for people to get into this industry. Why is that? And you've given us a lot of advice, so I don't want you to feel like you have to be repetitive. But do you have thoughts on why that is, and any new advice, you know, given that reality of growth, but hard to get your foot in the door?
Yeah, I mean, it is not straightforward, especially if you're moving from one career to another. And that's never easy, I think, in any career. But because of the attention this industry has had, I think, particularly in the last 3 or 4 years, I'd say, the level of anticipation, particularly among youth who see climate as a huge driver in their future happiness, I think. So it's much more intrinsic, I think, climate as a topic than perhaps it was in my generation. All of that means that young people are really drawn to this sector. Just as an example, you know, in some of just our Jamaati work around climate here in the UK, it's been relatively easy to attract people to do voluntary service in this space because people see the value of it, they want to contribute, they want to learn about this space. So I think that holds true for society at large. So I think this is going to get more and more competitive. But at the same time, remember, the industry needs to grow by factors, right? Not by 10% or 15% a year, by 30, 40, 50% a year. So I think along with the level of competitiveness, there is an increasing opportunity in terms of roles that are being offered. My organization has hundreds and hundreds of vacancies that they cannot fill. I'd say we have 10% of our energy workforce as vacancies. We need that many people to come because people are also moving into other companies. So there are opportunities, and people need to, again, make the right decisions, do the right learning, have the right sort of experience, and use their background to their best advantage to access this sector.
Awesome. Thanks, Al-Karim. And I'll ask one last question, and before I turn it over to you for any final comments that you would like to share with our audience today. You've talked about, you may not be a climate change specialist or something along those lines. However, you can leverage your other areas of expertise, whether it's in marketing or communications or finance, in order to get into this space. Do you have any recommendations, even in your company, right? You have so many vacancies. how would somebody who may not necessarily have a climate-related background, but does have that expertise in those other spaces, how do they make that CV or that cover letter attractive to these type of climate change related organizations, given their background?
Yeah, I mean, it's a challenge. And as I said, the CVs that I talked about earlier, the numbers of CVs means no matter how good your CV is, it still has a danger of being overlooked amongst the hundreds of other CVs. So even if you have the perfect CV, it's no guarantee that you'll get there. And that's why I think you have to use other avenues, particularly around relationships, networks, connections. Use LinkedIn, use your other means, use your alumni network to have that initial conversation. And you're much better off having your CV forwarded by someone in an organization to the recruiter or to the recruiting manager than you being, rather than your CV being housed in an internal system with 100 other CVs, right? So even receiving a CV by email from a colleague of mine means I will read it and give it a little bit more attention. So hence the power of networks, I think, is really important to do as a first step. Excuse me. And then, yes, polish your CV, polish the kind of areas of expertise, demonstrate that you've got a passion for this thing, demonstrate that you've done stuff to build knowledge around it, right? Whether it's through your own learning, through talking to people, to developing your own, white papers, right? There's no difficulty and Google's very easy these days to and of course ChatGPT as well, although that's not necessarily the best way to do it. But there are ways to actually then put together and think about some of these ideas in the sector you want to get into. And I would encourage those three things, the network, doing your own homework and building your CV around skills and writing a white paper or something, even if it's a 2-pager to show that this is what I think about the sector. These are the challenges I see in the sector, even if it's wrong, right? But try and get it a little bit right at least. And then submit that to the person along with your CV, because then there's much more tangible, I think, than just a CV, I want a job, right? Which is difficult for the other person to respond to.
All right, great. Al-Karim, do you have any final comments that you would like to share with us?
Look, I'd say to people who are listening, that there are opportunities, right? And it's a growing sector. It's not going anywhere. We're going to be dealing with this for many, many decades to come. So if you think about this is actually probably the biggest global challenge that we face today, right? Almost bar none, or that we've ever faced, because the challenges of it, the issues related to it, the north-south issues, all of these things make this really complicated. We have to change our whole energy system. And so I think there are opportunities, and for people who have the passion, the drive, the desire to learn, to grow, to take chances, I think this is a great sector to be in. Leverage what you have today, build on it, make those small iterations towards where you want to get to. And don't worry if that first, second or third job isn't exactly what you want, but you'll get closer and closer to it, and hopefully get to your goal sooner rather than later.
Awesome, wonderful. Al-Karim, today has been really delightful, and I speak on behalf of everyone, I'm sure, that we very much appreciate your time, your expertise, and your advice. It's been, it's actually tangible and very helpful regardless of where you are in your career. Everyone have a wonderful rest of your day or evening, and take care. Thank you, everyone.